What's up, folks? My name is Trevi. Welcome back to Tactical Tortoise, and welcome to the next part of our 9th edition rules coverage. In my previous video, Tsung Su and I jumped on the mics to talk about the core rules changes to 40k 9th edition, and now I'm all alone on my lonesome to talk about the terrain rules and give my thoughts. We'll be splitting off a third part as well, talking about the Eternal War missions that are also included in the book. Also, that'll be a separate video in part 3 of this little series. We do have the pages all organized and ordered in the correct order this time, so hopefully there'll be less sifting through an Imgur gallery trying to figure out what page we're supposed to be reading. So that should speed things up a little bit. But the first part of the terrain section is the terrain categories, and we've seen these for the most part already during the 9th edition spoiler season. We have hills, which essentially count as just part of the battlefield and only block line of sight. You can move over them for free. You also have obstacles, which give cover if you're within 3 inches and hiding behind them, meaning that no models are basically completely unobscured by the obstacle. They also don't block line of sight, it looks like, because it says that the obstacles use these normal rules for determining visibility. And you move over obstacles using the normal rules, which would mean that they do impede movement if they're greater than 1 inch tall. But I imagine we see a lot of house rules that count specific obstacles as 1 inch tall for the purposes of movement, just so it's not too obstructive on the table to play with them. And then you get cover while you're within 3 inches. Seems pretty fair and reasonable. I do like that there's realistic rules for obstacles in this edition. I like the terrain feature in general, but it was difficult to represent in 8th edition. It's like area terrain talks about the footprint of a terrain. You can move up and down following the normal rules for movement. If you're on or behind area terrain, uses the normal rules for determining visibility. And you can't attack area terrain. All right, fair enough. You also receive the benefit of cover if you're infantry, beast, or swarm, and you are within it. Keep in mind, that's not completely within it. So you can just be touching it, which is a little awkward. Some terrain in 8th edition required you to be the entirety of your base to be inside the terrain, but 9th edition looks like it's not true. Buildings, the one outlier that we have not seen any rules on yet were buildings for 9th edition. And here we have the rules for them. They are considered to be units rather than terrain features. You cannot move across them. Use the normal rules to determining for visibility, and you can attack them. It looks like this is the rules for sort of fortifications specifically. Interesting. Okay, so this is not actually a terrain feature that you can play. This is units with the fortification battlefield role. A little interesting that they're in the terrain section, but I guess it's nice to note those. The big change to 9th edition, obviously, that we've seen spoiled already, is that terrain gets these keyworded traits, which apply different benefits to the terrain feature specifically. We'll talk about those. We've seen these previewed a little bit, but a lot of times we haven't seen the specific verbiage of the rules. Defensible, we saw, allows you to shoot Overwatch on 5-up, or add 1 to your hit rolls. You can't do it while you're within engagement range of enemy units, so it only works sort of on the charge, I guess. And you choose what you're doing when an enemy unit declares a charge against you. Okay. As long as the 2 closest models in the 2 units pass over the terrain. Ooh. So that's interesting. So with a little bit more tactical placement, if, for example, you have a ruin wall, right? We'll draw on the screen here. If you have a ruin wall like an L, and you have a model out on the side, and the rest of your models are inside, and the charging unit decides to go around and ring around like this, so that their closest model was here, as long as the line between those models doesn't cross over the L, you aren't able to defend against the charge using those rules. I don't know how often that's going to come into play. +1 to hit, probably not that big of a deal, especially since melee attacks are going to be aiming to kill in this edition, I believe, rather than, you know, wrapping or something like that. So you'll probably just die instead of getting to swing back. But I think that's interesting. Definitely adds another layer to the game, which is cool. With the so the defense line trait. If an enemy is within 1, you can charge it as long as the charging ends the charge move touching the terrain feature and within 2 inches of the target unit. Units are eligible to fight and can make attacks if their target is on the opposite side of the terrain feature and within 2. Okay. I wonder if that's a trait that we see a lot of ruins given, just to sort of clean up the normal, the 8th edition ruin interactions where you'll block out people's charges. Whereas in this case, if you are within 1 inch, you can be charged, and if you're greater than 1 inch, you're probably able to be charged through a wall. Speaking of going through walls, we have the breachable keyword. Infantry, beasts, and swarms can move through walls, girders, chains, and foliage of this terrain feature without impediment. So that's the 8th edition ruin rule brought into 9th edition, which I think is awesome. It also works on beasts and swarms, so that's a really big deal, actually. Previously, it was only infantry, and beasts and swarms often got kind of screwed. So now it looks like basically only your vehicles, cavalry, and monsters are going to not be able to go through those walls, which is good. And I like that they sort of call out that you can call other terrain breachable rather than just ruins and stuff, because they do talk about foliage. And I think one of the most interesting things about terrain building is being able to build terrain into a shape that you desire, even though it has the same sort of mechanical effectiveness as like a ruin wall or a GW terrain kit or something like that. One thing we were just doing on AOWPI is we were building a Tyranid board, and we were building the L terrain out of capillary towers, and that's one position where this breachable terrain trait would come into play, because we could give those capillary towers interesting rules, but then also give them the standard rules of a ruin terrain piece. So I do like that a lot, and I think it opens up some more interesting options for terrain building, which is always nice to have, especially if you have old terrain in your collection that doesn't really work, but these new terrain rules looks like they're going to be a little bit more comprehensive. Difficult ground, you subtract 2 from normal moves, charge, advance, fall back, charge over the terrain feature, unless you can fly. So this is sort of the creator rule, although it affects movement phase movement as well. But doesn't affect fly. Interesting. It was always weird that the terrain didn't affect stuff that flied, that flew. That sort of crater terrain would still give you -2, even if you can fly over it, even though you can ignore terrain when you charge and when you fly in the charge phase. So I do like that this is a little bit more impactful, for sure. And hopefully we see this a little bit more often as well. I think detrimental terrain is always, it makes the game more interesting, because it gives you areas of the board to avoid, and it wasn't really something that we had in 8th, although in previous editions it was very prevalent. Most terrain, in fact, was difficult ground and would slow you down. So you had to trade off between getting cover and being slow. I think I do like that having specific terrain that will slow you down and also different terrain that gives you cover, that's fine. But I like that this is included anyway. Dense cover, so this is the one that was spoiled. The other rule that was spoiled as well, where it imposes a -1 to hit on units that are behind it, and if it's at least 3 inches tall, as long as the units aren't aircraft or 18 or more wounds. Important to keep in mind, obviously, that the hit modifiers don't stack in 9th edition, so if you're behind dense cover, you are... So effectively, if you're shooting through dense cover, I should say, you're effectively free to shoot heavy weapons and have horror and that stuff cast on you, and it doesn't really do anything because you're already going to be receiving that -1 to hit. A little bit annoying because the cover, I think, a lot of times will just have no effect, but it is what it is. I think we will see a lot of vehicles and monsters that ignore the move and shoot penalty with heavy weapons anyway, so imposing that -1 to them will probably be pretty important. We also have unstable position. You cannot set up or end a move on top of the terrain feature. Okay, cool. I like that. Probably something that will be good to add to ruin terrain and stuff like that, so you can, I guess, try to get rid of a little bit of verticality, but I don't know if it's that big of a deal. Exposed position. You never receive the benefit of cover while you're on top of the terrain feature. but it does give cover if you're behind it. All right, fair enough. So that's for, I think they previewed that alongside like the Munitorum ammunition canisters or whatever, the shipping crates, because they're just flat on the top with no cover. And it was a little questionable in 8th ed whether it was meant to give cover if you were standing on the top, but now there's a keyword you can just give to them. I do like that a lot. Obscuring is the other keyword that we saw. If the feature's at least 5 inches in height, then you can't see through or over it. I did talk about this in my previous video about understanding the terrain rules, and that there is some weird corner cases where the obscuring rule, I think, will be really awkward to resolve, especially if you have like a base on your terrain or something like that, which it does talk about in area terrain as something that should be discussed in the area terrain category rule. But there's going to be weird situations where, like, sort of the area of an area terrain feature blocks line of sight, whereas the actual terrain feature that's on the base is not obscuring you at all. And I think there's going to be some house rules that need to will need to be implemented to make that work. I think one thing that I'm considering for T5S2 is to create ruins that are all obscuring so that they all have this role, but sort of get rid of the ruin base itself and create a separate area terrain feature that will be the base of the ruin to provide cover. So effectively the ruin is only the walls. They have the obscuring keyword, and then the base around them is something else. It's like this light cover or something like that, which I think would be good. Speaking of light cover, basically the same as 8th edition cover. You get +1 to your armor save while you're within the while you're receiving the effects of light cover. Specifically against ranged attacks, and then heavy cover. This is a dichotomy that I hate. I think the nomenclature is stupid. You get +1 to your saving throws against melee attacks as long as the model targeting you, not the model making the saving throw, the model attacking. If they charge, they will ignore that +1 armor save. I guess they have too much momentum or something like that. But also it makes melee. It's not like a triplicate nerf to melee. We just have a billion other nerfs to melee. We don't also have to give them -1 or +1 armor save when you charge into somebody. It will. The reason to reiterate, excuse me, my point from the other videos. The reason I don't like this light cover versus heavy cover is that implies that heavy is somehow, more effective than light cover, or there's more of it. Whereas in reality, there's no overlap between the two rules at all. So sort of when you read the rules, you assume if light cover is +1, heavy cover would be +2. It would be my first impression of those rules, whereas it's absolutely not the right interpretation at all. And I think a lot of new players, especially players who don't have someone who is sort of enfranchised in the game to walk them through, are going to make that mistake. And they're going to be like, oh, I play other games, and heavy cover is usually twice as good as light cover. So we don't have to read through every bit of this rule, especially since it says +1 saving throw, right, in that first line of the rule. And I think a lot of people are going to get that mixed up. There's no reason to keep this light and heavy nomenclature. It's confusing and dumb. You can say range cover and melee cover, or you can say shot blocking cover and sword blocking cover. Anything like that. The name of your rule, some sweet game design 101. The name of your rule must convey the idea behind the rule. That feels like that should go without saying, but Games Workshop is not good at game design, so there you go. We have the scalable keyword, which allows you to move on top of obstacles. Interesting. That's obstacles specifically. And then infantry beasts, swarms, and models with fly can end a move on the upper floors of an area terrain feature. And move through the ceilings and gantries of a terrain feature. So interesting that you cannot move through the ceilings of a ruin or something like that without the scalable keyword. I actually like that clarification as well in here, and I think it makes a lot of sense. Cool. I love it. We should keep in mind that in the movement phase section, it does describe that climbing a terrain feature requires you to effectively do a vertical movement up the walls of the terrain feature. So you'll measure that vertical distance, but you have to be next to a wall and continue the trajectory of your movement up that wall. unlike 8th edition where it was sort of weird and a little nebulous, whether you had to climb up a wall or you could just like sort of teleport upstairs. We have Inspiring. Add one of the leadership characteristics of a unit while they were wholly within 6 inches of the terrain feature. If the terrain feature lists any keywords in this brackets, it only applies to units that have that keyword. So that's sort of some of the GW terrain kit stuff, where they would have a like Inspiring Statuary or something like that, where the big Space Marine statue and stuff will give +1 leadership to Imperium units while they're next to it. I don't like that as much, but I do like the idea of having those big sort of obstructing terrain features on the battlefield and having them have a universal +1 leadership benefit. You don't have to sort of justify it, I think, thematically, in order for it to be an interesting benefit. Especially with how important I think combat attrition tests early in the game are going to be, especially for large units. Having the access to a +1 leadership aura is going to be a big deal, and I think that's something that I'd like to build into T5S2 maps. We have some examples of common terrain features. Looks like this is pretty self-explanatory. We have craters, ruins, armored containers, barricades, and fuel pipes, and it tells you what the suggestions are. Makes sense to me. Ruins are area terrain, scalable, breachable, light cover, defensible, obscuring. Cool. Now notice here that they, and this is something I mentioned in a previous video, they don't have a base on their ruins because the GW terrain kits don't have bases with them. And it seems to me like the rules, especially for ruins, are designed without bases in mind. So you're obscured by an obscuring terrain as long as you're not sort of touching the walls of it. But as soon as you go up and touch the wall, you can see through the windows or whatever, which I think is very clean and very precise. I sort of wish that would just be the rule, but it seems like that's the intention of the rule. And the cover would only apply if you're touching the actual terrain itself, or you're up on this second level. You would get cover from that. And I do like that a lot. I like having the shadow area that gives cover because I think that's clean, sort of down in this area. But given the new line of sight rules, I think it would be better just to call the ruin sort of walls a ruin piece of terrain. Yeah, and then we keep going. We have woods. So now, notice the woods do have, obviously this is area terrain, they do have a demarcated area where the area terrain should take effect. So that's important to note as well. The Imperial Statuary has Inspiring for Imperium, just like I was talking about earlier. I think it would be more interesting to remove the keyword from that, and it makes the game a little bit more dynamic, and obviously you don't just continually benefit Imperium armies. So I think that's the way forward, is to make that Inspiring keyword. It's to not bracket that Inspiring keyword when you're running events and competitive games and stuff like that, but for narrative play, it's whatever you can do. I like the idea that an Imperium army defending their homeworld would have some extra leadership involved. I think that's pretty thematic and cool. And then ruined walls counting as obstacles. I love that. Industrial structure, I think, is an important one to talk about. They're calling it area terrain, scalable, breachable, dense cover, defensible. So it will give you -1 to hit when you're behind it. And it's defensible, but it's not obscuring. And I do like that. This is always an awkward... These gantry pieces of terrain, when you're playing a squad-based skirmish game, are always really weird to play around. The dense cover, I think, is a pretty reasonable sort of middle ground. You can't really say... Some people say, like, this is a ruin, so the first level in ITC blocks line of sight or whatever. And it ends up becoming this, like, enormous piece of terrain to fight through because the impact of this huge thing blocking line of sight is so big. And I think... whereas otherwise, if you just call it true line of sight, it doesn't do anything, right? Like it doesn't block line of sight to one guy. Like maybe you could hide one dude back here and that's it. But I like calling it dense cover. So it imparts that -1 to hit, I think is a good middle ground. And I do like that a lot for that style of terrain. Anyway, that's going to be it for our terrain coverage. Definitely going to be diving deeper into these terrain keywords in the future when we do some map building. So we'll see for the T5S2 Invitational, we'll be building custom maps for that based on the new mission structure as well. And we'll be keywording everything with these new roles and doing everything by the book. We might not keep exactly the keywords that they have here, but will be something very similar. So learning these rules and these keywords is going to be very important for competitive play, I think, into the future. And it just cleans things up. You know, all of your terrain, you have some selections here that you can build your terrain into. And all of your terrain will have the same rules regardless of where you play, what store you're at, you know, whatever. As long as your tournament packet specifies what keywords the terrain has, you know what they do. There's no house rules or anything like that required, or at least very, very few. So I think that'll be good, and I'm excited for these new terrain rules. And stay tuned for some more coverage of 9th edition 40k. We're going to be talking about missions next and going over all of the missions and all of the secondaries that have been released with this big leak. Classy, folks. Have happy wargaming.